reforming the system, changing the system so that in this country we have a fair education system and a productive education system.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. Francis, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm super pleased to have you, and I can't wait to get into sort of the meat of your research. But thank you so much for joining me.
Not at all. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So what drew me to your research, and I can sort of just start by giving the audience a bit of a background as to why I think your work is amazing. Because I came across a book that you co-authored called Engines of Privilege, and you tackle in Engines of Privilege one of these issues that have been popularized but not, in my opinion, not really researched, which is inequality that is perpetuated through private schools or public schools in the UK. And in the book you do, I mean, it's a phenomenal piece of work for me, because it opened my eyes to sort of not just what the current situation looks like, but the historical sort of progression of it, and how different governments have responded to it over time. So what led you to looking at this factor of inequality?
The short answer to that is increasingly realizing how important it is and what a big effect it has on our life in Britain. The immediate triggering factor was a meeting I had with my old friend David Kynaston, the co-author of the book. David is a major social historian who's written about the history of Britain since the end of the Second World War, and I joined up with him again about 6 or 7 years ago. He'd written a major piece in the New Statesman calling for a reconsideration of the education system, and I thought that was fantastic. And we teamed up together and decided, yes, we need to write a book about it. So for me, it gelled absolutely with my existing more academic research to build up the case and examine all the arguments in a kind of more normative way, and present my own expertise to try and influence the discourse that goes on in the public about this.
It's a pretty bold move, though. I mean, you must have ruffled some feathers in putting together a piece like that really highlights what is causing the inequality, or what is perpetuating the inequality.
Ruffling feathers certainly happened. I think it got a few odd reviews, should we say, in the national press, particularly from places like the Times and so on. And I think on the whole they missed the point of the book. They didn't read it properly. Perhaps that was our fault. But on the whole, it was very defensive, saying, "Oh, we're not so bad as you think," would be one way of summarizing the kind of responses that came to the book. I mean, other responses were just plain stupid. And on one occasion, we were invited to go and speak to the annual gatherings of the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference, which is a private meeting amongst head teachers, all the major schools, major secondary public schools and so on. And that was quite an interesting occasion, shall we say. in which we quickly explained our position. And majority of the discussion that came after, which was excellently chaired by Matthew Taylor, majority of the discussion was, again, very defensive. He was saying, he was kind of just denying all the statistics that we presented and just saying, well, in my school, we have lots of bursaries and so on, whatever. And sure, there are one or two schools where that's the case, but on average, it's not. On my school, it was fine. Was, if you like, to summarize the response that we got. Except that now here was the interesting thing at the end of this experience in the Daniel in the lion's den. The chair asked everybody in the room, and there must have been about 100 head teachers in the room, whether they thought the private schools in Britain were in need of reform. And they could answer either, no, there's absolutely no need for reform, or they could answer, yeah, then there's some, some reforms are needed, or they could answer some serious major reforms were needed. And much to my surprise, at least half the people in the room, I'd say, put their hands up in favor, yes, major reform is needed. And this was extremely puzzling and intriguing, and I've never quite resolved it. Why, on the one hand, these head teachers are very defensive. I don't know whether they appreciate what we wrote about in the book. They were very defensive, and yet they somehow felt themselves, yes, there was a need for major reform. So I can't answer that question. I still haven't got an answer to that, except that I think there are many people within the sector who would like to see reforms. I'm not someone who's advocating abolish all private schools. I'm advocating reforms, serious reforms of private schools, and I do think we need, on all sides of the political spectrum, not just in the Labour Party, but also in other parties and in the Conservative Party, there are people who see the need for some reforms, and I do believe that the debate is ongoing. And I'm a founder member of a group called Private Education Policy Forum, which precisely is going to be looking into the possibilities for reform and doing research, trying to throw more light on this sector of education, which is rather an opaque sector. I think you'd agree. Most people don't really understand what's going on behind those hallowed gates, except they can vaguely see all those rich resources in there. We need to understand it better to help policymakers who, in the future, we hope will look for reform.
I think one of the things that I sort of, I want to say the thing that resonated with me the most, but so much of the book resonated with me, was the fact that, for me, coming from a background of working in supplementary education and private tutoring, and, seeing who accesses that, and, coming from a business that I ran, which was tailored to high net worth individuals, it sort of, like, I was part of the story that you were telling, or what we were doing was part of the story that you were telling. Now, you touch on loads of important things now in what you just said about the headmasters and the headmistresses being in this sort of conflicted position where they know there's reform needed, but at the same time, perhaps all the reform is needed in the other schools, not here. And it's this conflicted position that exists in the education system where, we know there's a problem. We know there's a major area of education that can be fixed. But at the same time, we sort of, just push it away and say, maybe at some point in the future. And so looking at, the overall body of work that you've produced, what do you think are the key areas that can be, reformed in a sort of immediate as an immediate step?
There are various reforms which could be undertaken. My favorite reform is one which is reasonably major, which would be an obligation on private schools gradually to take in contingents of state school children, up to 30% initially, I would say. And I believe this would have to be an obligation, and that this would require some reductions in the luxuries. After all, in the luxuries which you find in many of these schools, I mean, the multiple theatres and swimming pools and so on and so forth. I believe that, yeah, I think that would be my favorite review, one which seriously opens up the schools for a more of a cross-section of the population and would seriously reduce the inequalities which exist. I mean, let's remember that even though it's a relatively small proportion of pupils, overall 6%, it's a much higher proportion of sixth form pupils. And in any case, because they have so much resources per pupil, about 3 or 4 times what's used in the state sector, which has been so deprived over the last 15 years, they actually deploy at least 15% of the teachers in our country, and usually ones who are more likely to have got degrees from high status universities and so on and so forth. They deploy that same or even higher proportion of the resources spent on education or spent on schooling in this country. So they may be small in numerical terms, but that's always the case in elites. Elites are small in numerical terms, but they control things. So it's not an excuse to say private schools are small, we should forget about them and concentrate on state schooling. Of course, we should concentrate on improving state schooling, but that's it's not a separate thing from reforming private schools. So I think my favorite is to kind of start to integrate these private schools into the state system, but they can retain the autonomy, retain their own governance and so on, as long as they would adhere to the regulation over the allocation of places in these state schools and so on. Now, there are other reforms which are also out there. One of the things which makes people most annoyed is the charitable status of many of the private schools. Perhaps more than half, more like 3/4 have got charitable status, but not all. And it's simply hard to see why institutions which serve the rich on the whole should have charitable status. And many people feel this is a major injustice. And I agree, and I think it should be finished, should be ended. It's not as simple as all that. I think it should be ended, or certainly the privileges that go with that should be ended. But it should remember that that's not a major aspect of the inequality. If it happened, if suddenly all the private schools lost all their charitable status overnight, then to keep up the same resources, they'd have to raise their fees, but not by an awful lot. And they would lose some of their pupils, but not by an awful lot. I calculated on the basis of existing scholarly evidence that they would lose about 30 or 40,000 pupils. Well, that's 30 or 40,000 out of over 500,000 pupils. So it's not, some schools would close down, but not many. So charitable status is something which we should go for. I'm currently conducting a review of business rates. That's another small thing, but significant ones. That is to say that private schools in Britain do not pay business rates to the local authorities. That system has actually just been changed in Scotland, which has a different system, as you probably know. And as of this year, for the first time, private schools in Scotland, post-pandemic, I mean, there was a sort of amnesty over the during the pandemic, but post-pandemic they're going to have to pay their full business rates. But it's not going to close down all those private schools in Edinburgh.
Mm.
It's, you know, they make a big fuss about it, but that's just perhaps understandable, but it's not going to make an awful lot of difference.
So it's one of the features that private schools or that run through private schools, both as a concept and as, you know, as an experience that the students get, is this idea of privilege. You know, you're mentioning that they have these charitable statuses that come with all sorts of privileges. And then you have, like, for instance, you know, if you look at, like, for the public schools, for instance, you know, there's all sorts of privileges that come with going to somewhere like, you know, Harrow or one of those sorts of schools. So, you know, you mentioned that you've looked at this idea of locus of control, you know, where how much people, you know, have this entitlement, you know, how I'm in charge of my own destiny, and how, like, there's this argument that private schools or privilege, you know, cultivates that. But you argue that the school doesn't necessarily cultivate that. That already exists amongst those students.
Well, hang on a moment. I think that what you find there is that the children that come in already have a high sense of self-esteem because they come from wealthy families, but they may not have a sense of confidence. This locus of control is a different set of attitudes. It's about the extent to which they feel they can control their own destiny, to the extent to which they feel that things that happen to them are just by chance, good luck or bad luck, or things that happen to them is because they've done something about it. In other words, yeah, they've made an effort themselves. So locus of control is a good thing. And the private schools do a job of raising that amongst their children. And well, you ask, well, why do they do that? Or how do they do that? It's the same as with the academics. It's because they don't just have a little bit more money to spend. They have 3 or 4 times as much. It's an extraordinary chasm of resources. You know, have people in political discourse, they sometimes discuss, you know, 20% here or 30% there. It's 3 or 4 times. It's an enormous chasm of resources difference. And so we shouldn't be surprised when this has a difference in outcomes. I mean, the people who pay those fees, they're not wasting if they thought they were getting nothing out of it, why would they pay all those fees?
I mean, but this idea of I mean, I watched a documentary about Eton, and, you know, in Eton they show, like, the new cohort of students being enrolled into Eton, and, you know, the dean or the head of the school gives them this lecture, and, you know, points to the plaques that they have for all the soldiers that, you know, fought in World War I and World War II that had gone to Eton. And I couldn't help but notice this sense of, you know, trying to instill in them the fact that we are Britain, you know, we are Great Britain. Eton is Great Britain. And it felt like he was trying to send them the idea that you guys are those guys. You guys are the guys that saved Britain from Germany. You guys are the ones that threw your bodies on the line, and it's almost like he gave them this feeling that Britain belongs to us. So this belonging feeling, or this sort of cultivation, I couldn't help notice, but you know, notice it. So is this something that is taught, or is this something that, you know, is part and parcel of, like, the education process in private schools in general, or is that just, you know, limited to the really top schools? Okay,
so let me be clear that there's no very specific scholarly evidence about this, but there are arguments about it, which is that sense of entitlement may come not from specific lessons. It's not, you wouldn't find it necessarily in the curriculum, that someone's going to teach you in a curriculum. You're here at Eton, therefore you should be expecting to be a leading judge or politician. But that the sense of it comes from the concentration of high wealth, high successful people, and from the amazing surroundings. I don't know if you've ever been to Eton, but if you do spend your 5 years at Eton, it'd be hard to come out of it thinking anything other than you're destined for greatness. Because you know, it's like an Oxford College or something like that in there. So I think probably it's all the surroundings, all the facilities, the top-notch resources in all the games and clubs and theatres and things which is involved, leads any ordinary person, if they go there, to think that they are destined for some kind of greatness. And I mean, let's admit it, in many respects, it's a terrific education. By the way, let me say something about the individual versus the public in general. I mean, I don't attribute blame to individuals about the decisions they make about their own education or indeed where they work. You would never bring about a reform by somehow making everybody guilty or enough people guilty that they somehow decided, oh, well, they're not going to pay for private education. That's not the way change happens. And you understand why parents always take the best decisions they can for their own children. We're talking about reforming the system, changing the system so that in this country we have a fair education system and a productive education system. So we have to often stand back from people's individual experiences. People wanted to know, where did I go to school and that? Well, I can tell them what school I went to, but that's really irrelevant to the argument, isn't it? You know, either my argument is correct or it isn't correct. So we need to change the system and persuade people that the system needs changing. But I don't wish to go around criticizing teachers, people who find their living by teaching in a private school.
Sure, no doubt. And I think one of the things that to me seems like it's a contributor to the problem is this attribution of status to different schools, different universities. So for example, like you mentioned in the book, that one of the key differentiators of these top schools is the fact that they really support the student in applying to get into Cambridge and Oxford. And, you know, and this is like a really important part of the process. Now, the fact that we've attributed so much status to Cambridge and Oxford, and, you know, there's such a major sort of divide between Cambridge and Oxford and between, say, for example, I don't know, the University of East London or something like that. Is this concept of status one of the drivers of this inequality?
Yes, it is. It's an important factor. Something which I don't think we said enough about in our book, to be self-critical. The one reviewer of our book who liked the book on the whole, who made this point from the Higher Education Policy Institute, made the point that we didn't actually address the status inequalities amongst the universities in this country. I mean, our defense was that we wanted to focus on this one question of inequalities within the school system. But the point is that the desire for higher status universities is what drives the demand for a lot of the private schooling. I mean, not exclusively, but a lot of that you pay for private schooling because you want to get your son or daughter the opportunity to get into either Oxford and Cambridge or one of the other higher status universities, sometimes called the Russell Group universities. And, you know, the private schools are good at doing that. That's what they deliver for their money. And so supposing hypothetically all universities were equal, everyone went to the local university, that sometimes happens in some countries, then the rationale for spending large amounts of money, extremely large sums of money on private education would be considerably reduced, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It would still be there because of the other things you get from a private education in terms of the broader curriculum, all the clubs and societies and so on. They would still be there. And what would also still be there would be those networks which you get. We haven't said anything much about it, you and me, yet about those networks, but the reasons why people get so angry about private schools is because this relatively small population tends to dominate our public and commercial life in this country in ways which seems totally undemocratic and unfair and unproductive as well. So
I mean, it's completely undemocratic. I mean, there is, I mean, from the data that, you know, you've shown in your book, and just broadly speaking, you know, 24 prime ministers from Oxford, you know, you have like, I don't know what the numbers were, but I think it was like upwards of 60% of, or upwards of 70% of judges or something like that. And so it's a really tough one because, you know, it's staring us in the face, but there's literally nothing we can do about it because those networks are the networks that are on the upper echelons of power in the country. So is it just part of the fabric of society and we just need to shut up and get on with it? Or, you know, can something be done about it? Because ultimately these networks exist. We all know they exist. We all like, I mean, there's a stat that came out of a research I read from Imperial that said 70% of the most senior jobs are never advertised and are never, you know, they all stick within networks. Nobody ever knew they existed anyway. And so knowing that these networks control much of society, much of the power in society, is there something that can be done about it, or do we just get on with it?
Well, I'm not a fatalist. I'm not one of those persons who says, well, there are all these things and they're so powerful we can't do anything about it. And nor am I one of those persons who says, well, if we somehow got rid of private schools, the rich would find another way of dominating things, because it does vary from country to country and things do change, and there are things one can do. No, for example, in terms of getting jobs, I think it's probably fair to say that HR, human resources, much as I love or hate them, in respect to my own job, the methods for recruitment into major organizations, for example, the civil service, have seriously changed over the last 20, 30 years. If I may use my personal experience or knowledge just to exemplify, two of my three sons recently in the last few years applied to the civil service, and that part of that process did not include naming the university you went to. So the decision as to whether they got into it or not was irrelevant. Where they went to university was irrelevant. The fact that they would say they'd had their qualification, they got this degree. And now that certainly wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago. I don't know exactly when that change came in. So it will be an interesting thing to see how those things gradually filter through the civil service structure. One of the things we least understand, by the way, is how privately educated people do progress through these hierarchies through their career. I mean, we know from the research that the Sutton Trust did that, as you said just now, something like 70% of judges are privately educated, and X% of the MPs are, and always a disproportionate number of a lot of the people in positions of public influence are privately educated. But we don't know often, you know, what does that start at the beginning and how is it affected as people work their way up through their 20s and 30s and 40s. That's one of the least understood areas. And one of the things is because you don't actually know where people are educated. See, you being me, I say, the researcher doesn't know. It's quite hard to research that. We're trying to make a few efforts in that direction. For example, we know where bishops are educated, usually. Often you can find that by searching online and try and find, are they more successful bishops or less successful bishops, things like that. But yes, the effect of all this, sorry, the reason, I'm trying to address your question, is it worth it? Could we do anything about it? I think civil service may be an example where that has had an effect. But also, if you did reform the education system such that those schools were opened up, then no longer, if say 30% or more of those people going to private schools were from ordinary low-income families, then I'm sure we wouldn't mind so much, even then, supposing the Eton was still dominant in 30 years, you wouldn't mind so much if they'd come from low-income families.
I mean, 30% is a respectable number. I mean, it's much more respectable than what exists today. So, there is that major, difference. And now the interesting thing that, I came across in your book was, you mentioned that when state school pupils and privately educated pupils end up in the same universities and end up in the same classes, the state school students tend to do better. Now, that to me is a fascinating find, because even though they do better, the outcomes are still in favor of the privately educated student. Now, does that speak to the job prospects of somebody going to private school, significantly increasing because they went to private school, or is that just that boiling down to the networks?
Well, I don't know fully the answer to that question yet. I think the bit about privately educated people not doing so well at uni, it's clearly there and has been since the early 1990s, at least. That's when that finding was first unearthed. It's significant, but not that substantial. So the first thing to say is, yeah, maybe it affects the probability of people who get first-class degrees instead of second-class degrees, for example. But maybe employers, increasingly employers are affected by whether you get a first-class degree or second-class degree. But in the past, it didn't make so much difference. So, okay, I think it's a very interesting finding about how kids do when they don't any longer have the support of these high resources in the private schools. They find themselves at university and they're the same as everyone else. But after they leave university, they've got their networks, maybe they've got their confidence still, and whatever it is, it leads them to do, on the whole, on average, better than their equivalent state-educated pupils. So there's a lot to find out about these processes, to understand them fully in our life and how they're changing over time. It's for me, it's turning out to be a lifetime of research, but I don't want it just to be research. I want that research to serve a public need in terms of reform. As you stated about 20 minutes ago, one of the most interesting things that we hope about a book is the historical approach, which I have freely admit that I learned a lot from David in writing the book with him and discussing these historical instances, is that this issue of the position of private education is not just coming up now for the first time. It's arisen in several crucial times in the history of our education system, in the history of Britain generally. next time it really comes up, and I think it is coming up now, we need to approach it in as an informed society and take the best decision.
When would you say was the last time it was a serious debate, about this issue?
In the 1960s.
Oh, all the way back then.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was, but by the 1970s, it was officially part of the Labour Party's policy. But the Labour Party, the Labour governments of the 1970s had very wafer-thin majorities in Parliament, and didn't have. I think I can excuse Prime Minister Callaghan at the time of not necessarily putting forward a program of reform of private education at that time because of the difficulties. I mean, what they did instead is they opted to reform the direct grant schools, which was a small selection of the semi-private schools, and most of them became private. And that turned out to be basically attacking the wrong target, because those direct grant schools were usually pretty good schools. And they all joined the private schools and made the private school system rather more academic, instead of joining the state sector. So the 70s, I think, was almost too late. And even though famous politician Roy Hattersley, now author and is in his 90s, I guess, he was very opposed to private education, and for a while, he was the education spokesman for Labour in opposition in the early 1970s, but he never became the Labour minister, never got. So 1960s, I mean, under Anthony Crosland, who was the education spokesman in the 1950s and became the education minister in the 1960s, but never had the courage to put the changes through.
And I mean, it's very difficult to put changes through when, you have an entire cabinet who, pretty much went to private schools. So, it's really difficult to try to put anything through.
Hit the nail on the head there.
Exactly. But I mean, to me, the missing part of it was, harnessing the public opinion, cultivating a sense of, exposing the public to this as a real problem, rather than, some broadsheet debate on, the Sunday Times or something like that. It's never, has it ever been a public discourse, that leverage the population's, interest in inequality, or has it always just been, some debate between the rich guys?
I think it's always a problem to bring a subject like this to the public because it's so hidden. The schools themselves are hidden. And what many people perceive in their own experience, they just don't see those schools. When they do, I think they probably get annoyed about it. So our simple opinion polling suggested that a substantive majority of the public do consider the system unfair. But beyond that, they probably don't have strong opinions about what should be done about it. So the debate needs to be going on now. I think that from when I was a young economist working in the 1970s and 80s, inequality generally, let alone inequality in education, inequality was not an important part of the curriculum of what was taught in schools or in universities. Nowadays, it is. I mean, you have report after reports coming out about inequality. There will be a major report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies later on this year about inequality in Britain, in which a constituent part is about inequality in education. And I just think that the level of discourse, even amongst the sort of educated parts of the country, is much higher now. The intensity of the debate about inequality in education is much higher than it used to be. So we can have some hope in that. I mean, it's higher because inequalities are much greater than they were 30, 40 years ago. But it's also, we can have some hope, I think, in that the debate will gradually filter through, I think, to more and more people.
I mean, it's a great time to have it. It's I mean, not, let me not say a great time, but it's very timely because, you know, COVID is exposed a lot of things, exposed the weaknesses and the lack of preparedness of state schools. But it's also exposed what networks, you know, do. You know, we've seen on the news, you know, all these sort of scandals of David Cameron getting on the phone to, you know, his pals and getting 500 million for this guy and 100 million for that guy, and you know, it talks to this problem of inequality that started off in schools, started off in state, in, you know, state school versus public school. But then it also, on the other side of it, is, you know, it takes for someone like Marcus Rashford to get this campaign to get school kids fed. So there is, you know, all the ingredients there to get a discourse going. To me, in my mind, is what are the missing components that gets this discourse really like charged up?
Well, it's a big question, and a really good question. Our group, the Private Education Policy Forum, is trying to do that. We've been going now for just over a year. Currently, we're still working entirely on voluntary effort, but hoping to get ourselves some grant funding to make more of you know, to do more. We hold events. We're holding a big event next month involving major public speakers, which we hope to hold in the House of Lords, but I think maybe it would be somewhere else. And we make press releases, and it gets us so far, and we're hoping to expand and bring it more to the public eye in collaboration with, for example, people like yourselves and other groups, in order to raise the level of awareness and raise the level of debate. And I'm very proud and pleased to be a part of this organization. I am one of, really the only main academic on that organization. It's mainly led by journalists and volunteers and students. There's a constant Twitter feed of commentary on the day's news that goes out. It's really striking the amount of feeling there is out there about this issue of private schooling. One of my colleagues on this Private Education Policy Forum group describes the issue as having a tiger by the tail. I don't know whether that's right, but it may be the case that if we can get yet more organized and more funded and so on, and devote more of our time, because all of us are working, you know, it's hard to devote that time to. At the moment, I think the Labour Party hasn't had sufficient confidence to take it on full as an issue, but they're sympathetic. And we've spoken to Conservative MPs and Lib Dem MPs as well. It's a process, and I don't think we're going to solve it in the next 6 months. But I'm, despite my age, I'm still thinking long term on this. And
no, absolutely, and rightly so, rightly so, because it's an issue that requires long term thinking and requires long term planning. And it's funny because last week I interviewed Professor William Tierney from the University of Southern California, who's just retired, and his research is on. He talks about the lack of involvement of universities and academics in such debates in society, and I think it sort of speaks to this point where you mentioned that you're one academic as part of this group. And to me, there's this striking problem where academics who do all the research, who do years of you know, looking at evidence and empirical data and whatever, there's still this wedge between them and society. there's no direct channels of communication. There's no voice. And do you think that that is part of why we, you know, we're to a large extent either misinformed or this information is hidden?
I think there's an anti-intellectual climate which is worse in places like Britain and America than it is in some other countries. At least that's my impression.
Mm-hmm.
And it's associated and linked with an anti-expert climate, for example, which has, I mean, it's been belied by the experience of the COVID pandemic, where everyone was forced to rely on experts a lot more for the vaccinations and so on. But we know that, for example, in the period up to the Brexit referendum, expert opinion was derided by members of the political parties and so on. It's difficult for, I think academics are not blameless. And I think organizations like yourselves are doing a good job, a great job, in fact. Academics are not blameless because they have stood rather too much in the background.
Mm-hmm.
For me, all I can do is say, well, the intellectual or the academic, or whatever you call us, does have a role in life and has an important role in public life. It's not easy for us academics because I try and do scientific research, objective, independent research, and it's important that my own desires for change should not influence the findings of studies that I undertake.
Sure.
Very important. And I know that lots of colleagues shun going into the public eye and expressing what they might be their political opinions or their normative judgments and so on. So there's only a subset of academics that do that, like myself, and some of them, I think, possibly lose a bit of credibility in their own academic lives. You'd have to ask them to find out about that. For me, I've decided that my views are clear on it now, especially now that I've written this book. But I insist upon my right to continue with doing scientific research on the subject, because all of us on various sides of this debate need to understand what's going on better and to contribute to the discourse.
It's rooted in this need for understanding, which is why, as I said, I really find this book to be, an exceptional piece, because just of how much exposure it does to the average person, or to these issues that are very hidden. Well, now, what a bit of advice would you give to, a young academic or somebody who's interested in this facet of inequality? What advice would you give them in wanting to contribute, whether to research or whether to groups like yours and in general, trying to tackle this problem?
Get involved. There's lots to be done. There's many things to understand about the private education system and its role in our public life in this country. So get involved with your own research, I'd say. Come and speak to myself or some of my colleagues. I've got lots of suggestions of things that could be done with people who are skilled at doing research, and make a contribution. That will be my.
How can people interact with you or get in touch with you?
There are two ways. The private education policy forum has a website. It's kind of an incipient think tank. It's basically a website at the moment. So just type in private education policy forum, and they will see that there. If they want a more academic take on it, see the sorts of stuff that I'm doing, they can look at my own webpage, which is just Francis Green's personal webpage. Type that in,
Yep.
and then they will see the sort of stuff that I've been doing. And if they wanted to get involved in doing research on this issue and wanted to have a chat with me, they'd be more than welcome to write to me at francis.green@ucl.ac.uk.
Excellent. We'll link those in onto the episode anyway, so people can get direct access to them. Francis, I think your work is fantastic, and I'm really pleased to have finally got the chance to meet you and speak to you. And I hope we can continue to work together and tackle these problems. Whatever we can do on our side with the No Show and the facilities that we have, we'd love to help.
Thank you. I should bear that in mind when I talk with my colleagues. And I've enjoyed our chat. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.